Welcome to another episode of the Bakari Sellers podcast. Today I have a friend of mine on here, man, and he is a South Carolinian. We're gonna claim him because he spends enough time down here, to say the least. But my good friend and CNN colleague, who needs his own show, really just needs his own show. John Avlon, how are you?
I'm good, man. I appreciate that. How are you doing?
I'm good, my brother. I'm good. How's your bride doing? He's also the second best political commentator in his own house.
That's true. That's true. No, Margaret's great. She sends her love. Everybody's doing good, man. Everyone's doing all right.
Well, look, we start each show here pretty much the same way because I like to give my listeners an opportunity to learn more about my guests that I have on and my friends and their eclectic backgrounds. And your background is interesting. And walk us through the arc of your career, from journalism to politics for some time now. Walk us through your first political job as a speechwriter for then Mayor Giuliani to your work in political journalism. And at what point did you decide that television and writing about politics would be your calling?
Well, I always have believed that politics and journalism, you should be driven. They're two sides of the same coin, right? You should be drawn because you care about the country, you care about politics, policy, elevating the civic conversation. I did begin after kind of falling in love with politics around Bill Clinton's campaign in 92 and 96. Worked for Rudy Giuliani when he was the mayor of New York. I became his chief speechwriter at a ridiculously young age, like 27. And after being an advanced man. But at the time, actually, Rudy and Bill Clinton's politics weren't as different as you might imagine. Rudy's changed a lot. And I'll defend a lot of what he did as mayor. And I was, proud to work for him. But we have definitely parted ways politically.
I can attest that you guys have grown apart.
I mean, it's just once you try to overturn an election, I don't have a lot of time for that. But there's a lot to, I was proud to work for his administration, was there through 9/11. And then when we left City Hall, because he was term limited, I went and started as a newspaper columnist at the New York Sun. And again, it was still about writing and politics and policy. But one of the things, when you served in government, is that sometimes the outside voices can have more influence in shaping a debate or elevating an issue or an idea than the people inside the meeting. Yeah. It's a balance. So started there and wrote my first book, Independent Nation, in 2004. Met Margaret, then started at the Daily Beast as a columnist. Ended up becoming editor-in-chief. Wrote a book called Wingnuts about extremism in American politics. Wrote another book called Washington's Farewell. And then 3 years ago, after being 5 years as editor-in-chief of the Beast, moved over to CNN full-time, where I'd been a contributor to Join the Morning Show as an analyst and anchor, and do this daily reality check segment where I try to call bullshit on the idiocies of politics. And but just bring some history and some humor and some perspective to our political debates, because they've been so insane lately, they could use it.
Yeah, I just had a moderated panel with Karl Rove, and it was refreshing to be able to have a high level policy debate, and we don't have enough of those anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm glad we're moving away from what did such and such tweet, etc. Before I get to your book, though, one of the most amazing things about you is your political mind is just brilliant. You and Axe, I'm blessed to have both of you all in my life, and you've written extensively about centrism and the values or virtues of it. As someone, for example, who wanted to see voting rights and police reform done, only to see Senate moderates kill it, for the lack of a better word, talk to me about this preservation of the filibuster and the way people see it as more important than two core issues for so many voters. And what do you tell people who believe that centrism left the core of the Democratic Party holding a bag and may contribute to Democratic losses in the midterms?
Well, first of all, I'd say, pull back, and centrism is about principles. It's about focusing on how to find common ground and building on it. there are ways that are more effective to be a centrist and ways that are less effective. I don't believe the split the difference approach, the mushy moderate stereotype, I totally reject. I'm about the vital center, about reaching out, trying to form new coalitions to move ideas forward. For me, while Democrats, I think, were a little quick about saying, let's blow up the filibuster because one day, they'll be in the minority. And we've already seen it with the Supreme Court. You don't want this Republican Party with a 51 vote majority to be able to do whatever it wants, the country. You want checks and balances. That said, if you believe like I do that our democracy is in deep trouble right now, that election reform and changing the incentive structures in our politics is critical. Why? Because right now all the power is in the extremes. These closed partisan primaries, the rigged system of redistricting we're seeing right now, what's happening in Ohio right now, North Carolina's pushing back, what's the way that Nashville's been cracked and packed. These are issues that are moving politicians away from reaching out and trying to reason together and solve problems, because the vast majority of them don't have competitive general elections. So I do think that combating voter suppression, election subversion efforts is absolutely critical to the future of our democracy. And I think you got to reform the filibuster. I think you can mend it, not end it. You got to move back to a talking filibuster.
Yeah.
Plenty of problems with that, but at least then you know where people stand, and you can't simply kill something with a silent hold sent by email. Put the pressure on the minority of folks who are trying to hold up the bill. So I think there are a lot of examples of hugely effective centrist leadership. And from being in South Carolina that there's a certain blind spot that certain folks have on the far left where they don't fully appreciate we need as a country more rural and red state Democrats. We need more state districts in play. And you're not going to get that solely by playing to the base.
No, I tell folk all the time, the progressivism of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doesn't win a race in South Carolina.
No, as a matter of fact, it hurts. I mean, look at what happened in all the Spanish language disinformation that was going around socialism in the last election really eroded Florida. We need more competitive races, more competitive districts, and the extremes of both sides. While I want to reject both siderism, because there's no question that the far right is far more powerful and larger than the far left. But it contributes to that feedback loop that stops folks from really, running competitive races. And when in South Carolina, when Joe Cunningham won the first district, that was a step in the right direction. That got pushed back. But we desperately need more red state and rural Democrats. We need urban Republicans too. We need people who are kind of just more competitive general elections will lead to a more representative democracy. And right now you got to push back not only on multiracial democracy, but majoritarian democracy. And that's a fight as old as time, but we need to recognize it for what it is.
That's a fact. Talk to me about Cinema and Mansion. They've created or crafted out this new fame at the expense of Biden's domestic agenda. Do you see that as being a positive emergence or development for our democracy?
No. And I think Manchin, look, there are times I want to take him at his word about his desire to move things forward. But for example, when he single-handedly scuttles Build Back Better, as opposed to being in the pole position where he could actually say, look, here's what I want in the bill, and it would probably get done. Find a way to get to yes. Just don't kill it, for obscure reasons. If you want to rebrand it the Family Fairness Act and say, look, we got to have a couple priorities. We're gonna focus on the killing the child tax credit because you're pissed off at people in the White House doesn't make sense for people. I do think that Manchin is
particularly people in West Virginia. And
I've done that in a reality check. I said, look at all these elements that would help people in West Virginia. There's climate and so many other priorities that you have supported by the president, supported by a majority of Americans. And I don't think that any one senator should be in a position to put a hold on that. But he is in a position where he could say, look, this is the kind of bill I can support. I would just like to see more of that constructive conversation. And I appreciate his sincerity and a lot of where he's coming from, but I'd like more, Angus King's, Sherrod Brown's, John Tester's, folks who you're going to have principal disagreements. You should.
Mark Warner.
Mark Warner, but work towards actually getting something done. Don't be Dr. No. That's not a constructive role that I think the center is uniquely positioned to play, particularly in a polarized country.
you've tracked the rise of extremist groups in the country and the mainstreaming of fringe groups into our politics. What do you think has caused this rise in extremist groups, and how do we root out extremism in our politics? I mean, the perfect example is, and I think that the most corrosive thing we have in our politics is the way that we redistrict and draw maps every 10 years. Literally, it's not sexy, but it literally is the most cancerous thing we have in our democracy. But I'm not sure that that tells you why we have a Marjorie Taylor Greene either. So how do we root this extremism out?
So it kind of sort of does, though, right? I mean, I'm not afraid to bring the wonk and talk about policy, because if you actually, if you're just into politics for the tweets, then you're actually not playing a constructive role in self-government.
You're not actually. No. You are corrosive as well.
Yeah. So don't be a slacktivist about this stuff. Don't be afraid. Every 10 years we have the redistricting. It's a rigged system by design, often, in collusion between the two parties, but not always, where they're killing the number of competitive districts. And if you have the combination of the lack of competitive districts and closed partisan primaries in a party, particularly that's been captured by Donald Trump and the far right nativist wing, then you're going to get a lot of Marjorie Taylor Greenes. If you have competitive districts, if you have open primaries, if you have ranked choice voting, you got a whole different deal, because the incentive structure in our politics isn't going to reward those people who play to the base and try to act crazy. And then you got a bunch of cowards who are afraid to speak out and do what they know is right because they're afraid they'll lose these close partisan primaries. So that is an original sin. But I think also in the fullness of time, you take a big step back. We're watching a backlash to globalization, a rejection, a demographic panic on the part of white folks who are just terrified about real multiracial democracy. And so they're resisting majoritarian democracy and representative democracy. That's not democracy, and part of the reason you study history, and I'm so passionate about using history, is because we gotta apply the lessons of the past. You got to look at, in the rise up to the Civil War, you had a bunch of elites posing as populists who were, terrified of demographic change, and they rigged rules, and we got a civil war out of it. Reconstruction reminds us that you cannot take any gains for granted. I mean, if you look back at all the tactics that were used then, the violence, the voter intimidation, the voter suppression, the election subversion, including, by the way, redistricting in 1870, the way the courts were packed by ex-Confederates to overturn civil rights laws that were passed in the 1870s. One of the things I talk about in the book, I mean, people don't believe this if they've been sheltered from it, or they've been taught it like a completely sanitized BS version of Reconstruction. Just look at, Alabama, where there are 180,000 registered black voters in 1900. 2 years later, there are 3,000. Don't tell me there's not a problem. Don't tell me there's not a problem that's baked in the cake of our history that we need to reckon with and we need to learn from. And that's why you got to pay attention to this stuff. It's not that it's necessarily Jim Crow 2.0, but do not underestimate the way that democracy and representative democracy and multiracial democracy has been subverted in the past. And we cannot repeat that. We got to learn the lessons and learn the right lessons to form a more perfect union.
Speaking of that history, which is important, I'm glad you took us there. How would you grade President Biden's performance thus far with the context of history, not in a vacuum?
Yeah, man. And that's the critical freaking point, right? I mean, you and I know about this, and I got a lot of affection and respect for you personally, but also your political analysis. You can't judge Biden outside the context of his time. He has achieved a lot with the narrowest possible margins in the House and Senate, right? So, partly when progressives got a little bit high on their own supply and talking about, FDR, LBJ-esque, agendas, those guys had massive margins that they could work within. And you have an obstructionist Republican Party. You got a handful of folks who, I mean, you get 37 folks in the House, who stood up to Donald Trump in some capacity. He got a handful of votes in the Senate. So you don't have a lot to work with. He's gotten a lot done. I do think that the infrastructure bill is historic. It's not sufficient. I think if the challenge of our time is about defending liberal democracy at home and abroad, which I believe it is, you need to pass some package of election reform. And the fact that Manchin came out with a bill that even codified voter ID in a responsible way and couldn't get a single Republican to sign on says a lot. That's mission critical. I think some version of Build Back Better, called the Family Fairness Act, needs to pass. But he's been working diligently. I think the right-wing echo chamber has a disproportionate impact on people's perceptions. We've talked about the way it's driven perceptions of him and Vice President Harris. But you got to push back on that. I think among independent voters, you see his numbers crater after Afghanistan. There's a pretty clear cause effect in that. So he's got to build back that. And
I think he is with the sound approach that they are taking in Ukraine, Russia. Now, the issue that he's going to have is that this shit going to last forever, and nobody knows what Putin's going to go next, and then you got to deal with China as well. So does he sustain that? But what's his grade? You went all around the book and you didn't give him a grade.
I mean, I hate giving folks grades. I'd give him a B+ right now, A- B+. And here's why. It's a deeply polarized environment. I think the most important thing history tells us is that character is the most important quality in a president. Joe Biden has character. He is a good man, and he cares about the country, and he understands policy. And that's a welcome change. And the one thing I'm real impatient about, and I've tried to make this point over and over again on our air, perfect's never on the menu, right? Especially at a time, we are not as evenly divided as it feels. We're a 70-30 country on most issues. The 30% screams the loudest, they suck up all the oxygen, and you can do it on policy issue after policy issue. So that should give folks some courage and some comfort, but his instincts, I think, are basically good. I think, there's a little bit of time takes a little bit off the fastball, and people respond to that. And I think, you got to acknowledge that. But where it counts, I think history will be kind. But this is a jump ball. I mean, Condi Rice said the other day he deserves a lot of credit for uniting, NATO and against Putin with this sort of economic sort of full court press. That's going to may be able to ultimately constrain or undermine Putin's rule.
Let's talk about your new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. What's it about, and why did you write it?
The reason I'm laughing is Margaret always gives me a little guff for that. I mean, 16,000 books about Lincoln. Why are you taking this on?
You have the one angle that nobody's ever covered in history about.
Yeah, no, and I was kind of kicking the tires, and I was happy to see no one had done Lincoln the Peacemaker. The book's about Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war, his vision of national reconciliation and reunification. And the reason no one had done that book before is he gets assassinated 5 days after Appomattox.
I was going to say there's not a whole lot of material there.
Well, he doesn't get to implement his vision, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a vision. In fact, He definitely does. And if I focus on the last 6 weeks of his life, from the second inaugural address to his final speech, but also you can see in presidential proclamations about Reconstruction. You can see in what he says to Generals Grant and Sherman and Porter on the River Queen and in Petersburg. He has a very detailed view, and basically his prescription is unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. And I that ultimately is actually the prescription that we put in place finally after the Second World War that helped create the international order that's created 70 years of relative peace and prosperity in Europe, which is pretty much unprecedented, which we're seeing a challenge to today. But I think Lincoln's leadership offers us still a path away from violent polarization. And at a time, also the history of that time reminds us we've been through far worse as a country. We'll get through this as well. But Lincoln's character and his wisdom, the fact that the core qualities of his character, empathy and honesty and humor and humility, those are all things that we can learn from just in terms of leadership lessons in how to stand up and try to be a uniter in divided times, which is the most difficult thing to do. But if Lincoln could do it in the Civil War, pretty sure we can stay focused.
What do you think historians and our general understanding of Lincoln gets wrong about him?
Well, a couple of things. I think first of all, we too quickly buy into the whole graven image of him as a very stern, stentorian kind of grave guy. One thing is he spoke in parables, which he learned from the Bible and from Aesop. He told jokes all the time. Partly that was to disarm people. It's a very good and important technique. Also, it was self-medication. he was a guy who combined opposites in many different ways. He was born in the South, moved north and west, but he was constantly struggling inside himself between this sort of sunny, joking disposition and depression, melancholy. And there's a story where one of his friends, after a devastating Union loss, goes to the White House and finds him on the second floor reading aloud from a book of one of his favorite humorists, a guy named Artemus Ward. And his friend, Isaac Arnold, the congressman, is furious. He said, "What are you doing? How can you laugh at a time like this?" And Lincoln, in his retelling, throws down the book and with his eyes welling up with tears says, "Don't you understand that if I could not find a way to laugh, I could not live?" It was medicine. It was self-medication. And so I think that sort of, the fact that Lincoln's constantly reading humor at inappropriate times is much remarked upon by his contemporaries. Also, the fact that when he assumes the presidency, he's seems on the surface to be the least qualified guy imaginable. He's got no executive experience. He's got no military experience. He's got one term in Congress. But what he has is character and the capacity to grow and learn. And that makes all the difference. And an inner decency, that he shows us that kindness is consistent with effective leadership. And that's a lesson we can't learn too much.
What do you want readers to get out of this project?
Well, I first of all, I want us to think about the study of peace. There are a lot of history books about war. It's high drama. It's understandable. But simply looking at the best practices of war misses the full equation. You can't understand peace and war in isolation. And so we do need to learn what are the best practices for securing peace, a just and a lasting peace. Not in a utopian way, but how can we make progress in that direction? What are the lessons of Lincoln's leadership that can unite us in divided times? And then there's also just all my work does deal with how you overcome hyperpartisanship and polarization. And I think learning from the lessons and the leaders of the past is absolutely critical because it directly applies to our time. I found this quote from Grant. And we can also talk about, just the way we got off the Lincoln path with Andrew Johnson, which was completely disastrous. But Grant got us back a bit, right? The fact he goes to Congress directly and lobbies for the 1871 Anti-KKK Enforcement Act, which he has implemented by a Southern Attorney General named Amos Ackerman. And they really killed the first incarnation of the KKK for a time. Mm-hmm. And they do it, by the way, by focusing on, they arrest and imprison the leaders. They send them to prison in Albany, and it really does. And it's because they are murdering Black local elected officials in the South. And they're just, this wave of terror because the military gains had not been secured at the time. But Grant, 10 years after Appomattox, is asked, he says, if we ever have a second civil war in this country, the dividing line won't be Masons and Dixons, he says. He says it'll be between patriotism and intelligence on the one hand and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other. And it's times like that where you look at the endurance of the Confederate iconography, the fights over the statues and all this other stuff, you realize why it is so essential that we learn our history, we learn the right lessons from it, and apply it. And that's, what Lincoln did in his best speeches as well. You learn from the past, you apply it to the present, so you can chart a path to a better future.
Man, this book needs to be in every school today, but probably won't be because waves of anti-intellectualism are just swarming our institutions of higher learning. Where can people find this book? Where is it available?
Everywhere and anywhere, but especially go to your local bookstore. Support your local independent bookstore.
Support Hoovalon. They need it. So go out and buy the book. I'm going to go buy a few more today from Barnes and Noble just because I'm going to give it out to some of my college nieces and nephews. I think it's essential. But I want to say thank you for your time today, John. Thank you for joining me. I know you're tired. He's coming in after the show. I don't know how people do morning shows, work on them. Get up early and do it. But thank you so much for spending some time with Bakari Sellers podcast, brother.
Hey, man, it's always a pleasure. Love your family. And I'll actually be back down in South Carolina at the end of next week. So I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah. Give me a call. I'll come down and I'll come see you.
All right. Beautiful. All right,
thanks, man. All right, be easy.